everybody. How are you today? After meeting so many successful executive directors and leaders in the nonprofit community, I keep hearing the same common concerns. My mother had over 23 years in the nonprofit world. She worked with people who were in recovery, or after incarceration. I asked her, Mom, what was the most joyful part of your position? She said, watching people thrive, knowing that she was part of the difference. And then I asked, Mom, I know you had many challenges when you were working in the nonprofit world, because I heard about them. What were some of the speed bumps? She said, honestly, I was spread way too thin, but my heart was in it. Between the student and the staffing challenges, the rising cost, the funds, and the cost to operate. With that being said, I'd like to introduce John Finch, COO of Ulster Savings Bank. John?
I want to thank the insurance and payroll teams for putting this together. My name is John Finch. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the bank and also Executive Director of the Ulster Charitable Foundation. As I looked at the list of people attending, this really is the who's who of local nonprofits. And I will tell you something, and every time I hear Kelly and Dan and Steve Prosser talk about insurance, I learn something, and I just sit there and I think, never ever knew that. Kelly from Unshattered, it's a phenomenal organization. The women that work for her are in recovery from addiction. You saw some of the groups that they do, and it's just incredible.
So with that being said, Stephen Prosser, and back to the basics with insurance. Thank you.
So my goal today is to bring up some core coverages that all nonprofits usually have. Insurance can be very confusing, technical, so hopefully what we can do today is bring a more simplistic approach. So property insurance is policies that protect property owners and renters from fire, damage, and theft. And three components of property that we all usually utilize: buildings, business personal property or contents, and loss of income. Today, the most important part of property insurance for all organizations is insurance to value on your buildings. And the key point of that is at a time of a loss, we want to make sure that your buildings are properly valued, because it could jeopardize the claim and the amount that could be paid out on the building. So I would tell you that this has been a hot button this year with all the insurance carriers. Next coverage is general liability. So general liability can help cover claims for bodily injury or property damage caused by your business. And primarily this coverage pays for medical payments, judgments, settlements, but one of the key coverages is legal and defense costs. And that's what can be very costly when you get into general liability coverage. Next, we have commercial auto. That protects against bodily common losses such as property damage, theft, and injury. And your business auto policies are broken up into two sections. The first section is your liability section, and that's for your bodily injury and property damage. And the second section is your physical damage coverage, which is comprehensive, and people can think of like theft, fire, glass, falling objects, hitting the deer. Those are comprehensive claims. Collision is simply hitting another vehicle or hitting a stationary object like a guardrail. Umbrella policy provides extra liability coverage on top of your existing underlying policies. These are liability limits that are above your initial liability limits. Usually it's a 1 million, 2 million. On your general liability, you get limits of 1 to 5 million on your umbrella. So your umbrella covers over your general liability, your employee benefits liability, your business auto liability. There's a coverage on workers' comp called employer's liability, that covers that, and professional liability. Workers' comp and disability. Simply, workers' comp is employees' injuries on the job, disability, employees' injuries off the job. So workers' comp provides income and or medical care for workers who are hurt or made ill as a direct result of their job. And disability helps to protect your income if you become disabled and unable to work. One key component of workers' comp: your volunteers are not covered. As far as disability, New York State's statutory disability is an average wage of 50% of the employee's average wage, up to a max of $170, 26 weeks, and there's a 7-day waiting period. Builder's risk. That helps protect projects from certain types of property damage during construction. If you're building a new building, if you're adding an addition, if you're doing renovation, it's important that those new constructions are placed on a builder's risk because they're specialty coverages that are not included under your property. So these cover claims of on-the-job work sites. They break a pipe, they steal materials, they steal tools, they wreck the sheetrock. All those construction items are covered under a builder's risk policy. This is probably one of the most important coverages, is your directors and officers. And that covers directors and officers of a company against lawsuits alleging a breach of fiduciary duty. And some of the examples for some unintentional acts that would be covered under this: wrongful acts on managing your company, misrepresentation of company assets, misuse of company funds, fraud, and failure to comply with workplace laws, directors and officers. A very key coverage for all nonprofits. Next is employment practices liability. That helps protect against employment-related claims. Now, EPL can be purchased either two ways. It can be purchased monoline on a standalone policy, but what you usually see is that directors and officers and employment practices liability are written together. Professional liability. Some nonprofits have professionals on staff. This covers claims arising from errors, mistakes, or negligence in the delivery of professional services. And usually when you're written with programs, it's a requirement that those professionals have their professional coverage in place. Lastly, very important too, cyber liability. So what this coverage can cover: legal fees, data recovery, system damage repair, ransom demands, and notification expenses. Going away today, I think the most important thing is all coverages are important, but one that I know always comes from the nonprofits, again, is your D&O and your employment practices liability. And cyber is important to every organization, profit or nonprofit. Thank you very much, everyone.
Jennifer Berry is the Senior HR Specialist with GTM Payroll and HR Services. Jennifer is here to discuss nonprofit world HR issues. So help me to introduce Jennifer Berry, GTM.
I'm dealing with some of the HR challenges that many of you are probably dealing with on a daily basis. Not all nonprofit organizations have an HR department, but it's really the person that is bringing everything to the organization related to employees, bringing a culture, establishing commitment to a mission. We all probably have a lot of difficulty in recruiting and retaining employees in the nonprofit world, partly due to funding. Important thing for nonprofits to lead with their mission. That's what gets you people that you want. You want people engaged with your mission. Again, the key piece, for some of your organizations is the hiring, training, keeping people happy at your organization, make sure they're representing the organization appropriately to the community. HR helps align that organization with the mission, and he helps to keep those on the ground focused to the matters that are important to not only you, but to them. And HR connects people to the strategy. So these are the challenges. I would say these are the top challenges that I deal with on a daily basis with the nonprofits that I work with. Again, funding is probably the biggest. It's hard to have a workforce that's consistent. It's hard to know what's ahead down the road. So that really brings a lot of challenges, and you're going to see that that's kind of the linchpin to some of the other topics we're going to talk about. But again, I do think the thing that nonprofits generally have that for-profits do not is the culture, the mission. And you really usually want people that are already living that mission and living that culture. Compliance with federal and state law, this is a challenge for every business out there. But it's especially difficult when you're classifying employees, when you're using consultants or independent contractors, which I know you all do. Volunteers, there's a lot of things that you should do for them, and then there's a lot of things that you absolutely shouldn't do for them, because if you do it, then they are considered employees. So there is a lot of burnout. There are times where we're short-staffed, either because of funding or because of turnover. Most people go in a certain direction in their head when they hear about diversity, but one thing that's true, especially now, is There's 5 different generations out there working right now. And there's a lot of the older generations working in nonprofit organizations, right? When your funding changes year to year, how do you manage your workforce? How do you keep them employed? Are you having to lay off people on an annual basis with hopes of bringing them back? What I generally recommend when it comes to the pay and the attracting is, again, lead with the mission, lead with the culture, but think of pay in a more general way. Flexibility in schedule, flexibility in work location, offering, an employee assistance plan. There's a lot of things that you can do that other for-profit industries, organizations cannot do. So I say lead with that. Often the limited funding will limit the benefits that you can offer. Many of the organizations are small and not required to offer things like health insurance. Again, I think some of those other benefits that I just mentioned, plus maybe giving good vacation time, maybe a company event that doesn't have to be high cost. Those are the things that are going to keep people. And even in the for-profit world, those are the things that keep people too. Utilizing volunteers is often a result of having limited funding. This is what we just talked about a little bit, creative compensation. Another thing I do with some of my clients that are nonprofit is, even though they typically pay lower on a regular annual pay scale, we do this thing called a total compensation sheet, where you show them all the benefits, the value of all the benefits you're giving them, including time off, including if you're offering health insurance and things like that. And they realize that they're actually getting a pretty valuable package from you. Grant funding, as we discussed, is part of the reason that there's limited funding. It's probably hard at times to get volunteers. Working with the community and getting involved and getting your face, your mission, your culture out there can help establish a really good group of volunteers that are either regular or people that you can call upon, and that really helps you with limited funding. Look at your current workforce and see what you can pull them to do. See, many people have skills and experiences in other areas that you may not. You should in New York State, you can't pay minimum indifferently. You cannot ask candidates about salary history. You also should not be paying your volunteers at all. You should not be giving any in-kind gifts to volunteers, because there is a test that's kind of balancing. Are they an employee? Are they a volunteer? Are they an independent contractor? And if you get that classification wrong, that could really lead to a lot of penalties out there. New York State is auditing for these things right now. You should evaluate your jobs as often as possible. Determine if volunteers can help again. Determine if you can cross-utilize talent. Set wages at a reasonable level that you think can be consistent. In the nonprofit world, it's interesting. The Federal Labor Standards Act applies to most organizations. That's the federal law that requires you to classify your employees correctly. Some nonprofits do not follow FLSA because of the size of their revenue. I don't know if you've all heard the terms exempt employee, non-exempt employee. There are a lot of risks to classifying people the wrong way. Non-exempt employees, if they work more than 40 hours in a work week, they're owed overtime. I can tell you that a lot of people receive a lot of penalties and interest by classifying people as exempt employees and not paying them overtime, especially in the nonprofit world, because we're all giving in this world and we're all working and willing to lend a hand at any given moment, and we're not tracking the hours appropriately, and people should be getting paid overtime. So that's really something you should focus your attention to. Collecting all-time work. Make sure you're monitoring and having records of people's hours worked. Again, that could affect measuring for overtime. That could also affect your scheduling, knowing where people are and when. Another thing that New York requires of all employers is that you give your employees a lunch break. New York requires you to have records, especially for your non-executive staff, of them taking lunch. And that's another area that's very heavily audited right now. Track your volunteer time, but track it separately. You do not want volunteers to be misclassified and eventually become employees. Frequency of pay is another thing that is across the board for profit and nonprofit. If 25% of an employee's work is done basically using their hands, literally manual work, they need to be paid on a weekly basis. Most businesses in New York especially pay people bi-weekly or semi-monthly, meaning every 2 weeks. So if you have people that would potentially fall into that classification, it's very important that you look to make sure you're doing it the right way, and if you need to pay them weekly, that you're doing so. And then independent other contractor rules, I had an interesting question earlier about independent contractors. Make sure you're following the appropriate classification for people that are contractors as well. One thing I discussed earlier with someone is that they were providing workers' comp insurance for an independent contractor. You generally only give workers' comp to your employees. And when they're looking at classification, if the state were to come in and audit you, and they saw that you were paying for someone's workers' comp, then they very likely could be considered an employee. The classification, again, is very important, employee versus volunteer.
We have people who punch at 9 to 5, and they take a lunch, and stay till 5:30.
Mm-hmm.
Does it actually have to be that they went from 9 to 12 and sign out and then sign back in?
So especially if they're a non-exempt employee, meaning generally hourly employees, if they're not punching out for lunch and you don't have a record that they took a lunch, if someone were to audit you and there's no record of lunch that's being taken, then you could be fined for that. So I recommend having a record, even if it's a manual timekeeping, or have an attestation from your employees on a regular basis where they're saying, I'm taking lunch. And it only applies for employees that work over the lunch hour, and they have to work 6 hours. So people that don't work 6 hours, or don't work over the lunch hour, which is what you would expect, 11 to 2, they don't have to have the half an hour, but I can tell you that this is another one of the areas they're auditing, so if they come in and there's no records, they will assume you're not giving them lunch.
What if employees are paid for the full day, but they're supposed to take their lunch, so they essentially get a paid lunch?
Mm-hmm.
Does that apply to?
Yes, you have to have proof of them taking lunch.
Okay.
And it applies to exempt employees as well, so people don't necessarily keep track of their time. So most exempt employees are paid the same thing all the time, and they don't have to keep track of their time. But I would also recommend for those employees having a record, and it's usually you and your team, usually the leaders of the organization, make sure that you have some record that lunch is being taken. Like I said earlier, you don't want to necessarily provide benefits, pay, or other things that you would normally provide to an employee because it's evidence of you treating a volunteer like an employee, which could then lead you down the road if you were audited to having to treat them like an employee, pay them, and then be liable for back pay, back overtime, all kinds of craziness. But the odd thing is that anyone working for you, employees, independent contractors, volunteers, I always recommend even vendors that you have that are regular. So we have a guy that works in one of my offices that is there weekly to do the cleaning. For all of those people, you have to provide sexual harassment training under New York law. It's because they need to be aware of your policies. They need to be aware of how the complaint mechanism, how they would report something that happened while they were in your business, and other areas that they could go to if they needed support and assistance related to being harassed, bullied, or otherwise in the environment of your workplace. So that's one thing that we do have to provide for volunteers and independent contractors that is kind of against everything else that we've been talking about and making sure that we treat them differently. New York State requires annual harassment training. That training needs to be done around the same time every year, and new hires as well need to receive this training. Yes?
Do volunteers have to go through a background check as regular employees would? Do they have to do that same process?
That is your own decision, depending on what business you're in. One of my clients is an independent school, and they just have a policy because they're working with children, that everyone who's in the building regularly with students needs to have a background check. There's no legal requirement, either New York State or federal, that requires a background check. So that's up to you, but the only thing I would caution with all those kinds of things is making sure that you're consistent with your application.
They typically come to us as a corporate sponsor. It could be corporate, it could be faith-based, it could be a PTA group, it could be Rotary.
So if they're regular groups, I would let them know that you are under New York State law required to provide this training. If any of them have given the training themselves, you can have them attest to that, and that would take that off your plate. But if they don't, the best you can do is try to get as many people as possible. And you only have to do it annually. So if you set up a date and you have regular groups that you work with, you can invite them to attend, but it is under the law. You are required to train volunteers. And there's a lot of requirements with that requirement. So you need to hand out your materials, and you have to have people sign off and have a record of the attendance, so all those other good things. Again, I think you have an advantage in many of your businesses where you can lead again with the culture and the mission and perhaps the lifestyle of the organization, so different hours, different opportunities, whether it be working remotely or flexibility for people with families. But also try to find people that are into your mission, that are into your culture, because they're gonna wanna be there not for the money. You want them to be there because their heart is in it, because they're trying to make the same effect on the community that you all are. I've had many situations where I've made an offer to someone that I thought they weren't going to accept because it was significantly lower than the market rate. But when I sat with them and talked about why we wanted them and how we believed they could add so much to the mission, they were compelled to join the organization. So there's a lot of messaging that you can do to help with the recruiting. Try to figure out ways, again, that you can keep people. I know that's hard, especially when you have transitioning opportunities over the course of a year due to funding. Try to have a base crew. If you have a base crew, try to invest what you can in them for the future. Let them know that you see them there in the future. Let them know you're willing to help build them up to the next level or to create leaders out of them. Give them learning opportunities. Something as simple as you telling them some of the things that you've learned and experienced over the course of your time in your business. That's as helpful as anything else. There's a lot of trainings online that are free. You can go download those. There's management curriculum out there that you can give people that you now want to have maybe 50 volunteers reporting to. People sometimes are thrown into these situations where they've never managed people and they don't know really how to even communicate with them. So there's some of those skills that I think it's important, especially again with regards to retention, but also keeping that main workforce with you for longer periods of time. A lot of nonprofit businesses have a hard time getting executive directors, or they stay for a short period and then they leave. Again, that's the pay, and then a lot of the time it's having to deal with the board and things like that. Again, I think lead with the culture, lead with the mission, get people whose heart are in it, get people who have experience that they could really share with the organization, and that will be helpful in your recruiting. These are some of the solutions. Again, we talked about mission-driven, non-compensation benefits. The total compensation document is what I talked about earlier, where you lay out not only the pay that you're providing them. I notice with my nonprofit employees that if I give them an offer and in their offer letter, I list out the number of vacation days, the number of holidays they're getting, the number of this, the number of that, the benefits. I would not normally do that in an offer letter. It tends to kind of bolster, and then also let them know what they mean to the organization. Again, career development, giving them opportunities for growth in the organization, or at least learning and investment in them so that they have opportunities for professional growth. And then creating a positive workplace culture. I know a lot of us are so busy, you're running from one thing day to day, but really take time, stop, smell the roses, and try to create that culture that makes people want to stay. So compliance, again, we talked about a handbook only generally. It's becoming a requirement. There's so many required policies that we need to distribute to employees in New York State federally that it's almost silly to have to give them 10 different pieces of paper. They can all go in an employee handbook. I recommend sharing those handbooks with your volunteers as well. Again, especially because that's where the harassment policy generally sits. So definitely share those. It also lets them know who they're dealing with, the policies, the culture, the different things that are going on when they're coming in. Another thing that applies to all of your people, whether they be employees, volunteers, I'll get to in 1 second, or independent contractors, is the fair treatment policies, whether they be federal or state, they apply across the board. So any of our accommodations, our EEOC type of stuff, that's important to share with everyone. Yes?
Would it be beneficial to have a separate handbook for volunteers? It doesn't.
A lot of people do, and any of the employee-specific policies, so about pay, about vacation time, about schedules, those types of things, don't even put them in there.
Right.
Just the mandatory policies, that's a really good idea. If you have the opportunity to do that, that's the best way, because when you're classifying employees, if there's someone that's kind of a volunteer, but they're treated like an employee, giving them that handbook would be evidence, even though it would be meeting other compliance-related things that you need to do. So it is a balance, and that's actually a really good solution. Also, I know that a lot of you may work in multiple locations, or you may have, make sure that you have all of the federal and state posters where you're working, because the volunteers need to see those as well. Leaves, some of this is applicable, making sure this should be in your employee handbook for your regular employees only. And we talked about this a little bit, insurance, if they need to be out for disability purposes, or if they're out for workers' comp reasons, you need to make sure they know the policy to follow, make sure that you are following it yourself. Watch out for New York State mandated sick leave. This applies to all employers. It does not obviously apply for your volunteers. And as you can see below under mandated leaves, all of those are required by New York State, regardless of what type of business you are. So just keep those in mind. We just had one voting leave where employers had to give time to employees who may not otherwise have time to vote. These are just some tips about talent management, reducing burnout. Recognition and rewards is a very simple one. Learning about their families and their work-life balance is also very helpful. And again, it tells people that you care. Professional development and performance management. How many in here have formal performance management in your organizations? People often think performance management is a negative thing because a lot of employees do anticipate that and they don't like meeting with people to hear about how they performed. But I find it actually has a much more positive effect on employee morale, their performance overall. It allows you to set goals, and some of this is if they're going to move up in the organization eventually, that's the time to do it. It also tells them that you are making them a priority. So I do encourage all of you to engage in performance management, whether that be annually, whether it be ongoing conversations, anything that works for you.
Do you have an opinion about, we just have PTO time
Mm-hmm.
instead of
Yep.
vacation
Yep.
holidays
Yep.
or vacation sick, et cetera?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion about that?
No, I mean, as long as you're providing the required number of days under the sick law, you can have it all in one combined policy. Sometimes it's easier to manage, quite honestly, and I find that most people are going in that direction if they're not already there. So you want to make sure that you have a team that's engaged. Make sure you're training your managers. Again, you don't want to throw them in a room with 50 volunteers and have them have no experience previously. Sharing ideas and problems. How many of you have regular meetings with your employees? That's very, very helpful. Just, again, giving them insight into the business, letting them know we're part of a bigger thing. Obviously, we are sharing those missions and those visions, but that is very helpful, again, with retention. Don't limit discussion to annual evaluations and/or disciplines. Sometimes the people that are doing really good work, we don't get to them, right? We don't have conversations to say thank you. That's a very difficult thing because I find that so many days go by where I'm just dealing with problem issues. It may not be a problem person, but it's a problem issue. And you forget, hey, I forgot to tell that person they did a great job. Embrace family work needs, recognize talent, and then use engagement or culture surveys for direction. Diversity is making the world a very difficult place to function, especially in the workplace. If we have 5 generations out here working with us, some of them have varied experience in using technology. Often many of them have experienced different leadership styles depending on where they're coming from. People are coming from all kinds of different industries, so that's another piece of diversity. I always recommend diversity and inclusion training. It makes people aware of their surroundings and what they're doing. You know, just be open to conversations with employees about some of these topics because this is something that a lot of people say, well, we'll get to that later. If anything, I would say be creative about how you attract and retain talent. Make sure you're classifying your workers correctly, whether it be employees, independent contractors, or volunteers. Make sure you're creating an engaging environment and help plan for a future for your people.
As far as classification, is it ever customary to ask the individual if they have a preference?
No.
No.
No, you are the
We should take the
employer,
lead on that.
especially if they're an employee. I mean, independent contractors, if you're working with a vendor or someone that comes in periodically, yes, you have that discussion about you're an independent contractor. They direct their own work, they typically have their own business or their own experience that they're bringing with them. You need to be clear with people about that, but you do not ask them unless there's two positions open and one is to be a volunteer and one is to be an employee. I would direct your own workforce as a leader.
I would like to come back to that lunch thing, because I do have huge issues with people at my job, and they say they don't want to take a lunch, you know, they sit at their desk and eat their lunch and.
So under the law, so it's the employer's responsibility, which that goes to directing that there be some documentation of it, because it's really the only way that you approve of it, and you need to provide it to them. What they do with it or not is up to them. They're supposed to have the time to pursue personal interests. They can be required to stay on location, but they can also leave, depending on whatever your situation is. You can direct that as well. But if you were ever audited on that issue, they would need you as the employer to show proof that you are giving this to your employees. And so the only real way to show that is that there's a record. And New York requires an unpaid leave for lunch. They don't require you to pay, and technically if they're hourly employees, they should be punching out for the half an hour that you're not paying them. If you do choose to pay them, that's great, but there should be some mechanism to keep track of that half an hour. And it is only a half an hour, so some people provide 1 hour lunches. That's extremely generous. You can't allow an employee to say, I'm gonna take my lunch later. You can't let them say, I'm gonna leave a half an hour early to make up for that lunch. That would not be considered taking a half an hour for lunch. It has to be taken what they call over the lunch period, which is anywhere from 11 to 2. And for those of you that have minimal workers working together, if you have multiple locations with a few people here or there, and it's difficult to leave something unmanned or whatever, you can be creative about how you're doing those lunches. But it's really looking at the employer and saying you're giving your employees an opportunity to have this lunch and pursue their personal interests. Yes?
Yeah, trying to figure out ways to make that easy for everybody. Would it suffice to send a schedule each week that says, this is the time?
You're here, yes. And I recommend that, especially when you only have a few people. And be flexible to the extent you can or whatever, if things pop up for people, but I think that's very helpful. That's also another documentation of lunch being taken by your employees.
I run a statewide internship program. If a person is considered an internship and they're paid, are they considered employees?
Yes. Again, there's the hour, if they have to work a certain number of hours and over the lunch period, so if they're working different hours, there's other meal break laws for people that work later, but the interns would be considered employees.
And would they also need to be paid weekly?
Are they manual workers?
It's a little different.
You're using your hands, like creative things, but manual labor.
Well, it's not the term manual labor.
What is
So here's the thing, New York, just like many other laws, is not very specific when defining manual labor. The definition under New York law is spending 25% of more of your time using your hands at work. Now, if I sit at the computer and do this, no, that's not considered manual work. They give examples, typically maintenance, custodial, construction, building, people that move furniture, working on cars, working, what?
Making birdhouses?
No, I would consider that more of an art or a craft. Yeah. And that's one, again, because the definition is so limited, it's very difficult to apply, so it's not something they're really looking at. Department of Taxation and the IRS both look at frequency of pay if they do audit you. It wouldn't be why they'd be coming in, but they would do that evaluation for you. But what you're describing, no, I wouldn't consider that manual.
And so if we have a really nicely worded statement in our employee manual that says, we understand that this is a lunchtime between 11 and 2, that our hourly employees are expected to be able to, are given a lunchtime of a half an hour or whatever we choose to give. And it would be documented as such on your time sheet. And if
the timesheet, yes.
But we're saying that we expect them to document it on the timesheet, and that, can we also state you may not not have a lunch
Delay.
in order to, you may not delay your lunch in order to leave early,
Oh, you absolutely should have a policy that says all of this, but here's what I do when I'm doing payroll. I look at every single person's timesheet, and if I don't see 30 minutes taken for lunch, I add it.
and what about for exempt staff?
Well, exempt staff that doesn't have a timesheet, again, that's a little more loosey-goosey, but all the documentation that you have in the background would be sufficient, especially if you also have hourly worker that you can show are taking lunch.
So we talked about lunch. What about breaks? What is the law around breaks?
There's no other requirement for breaks. There's also no requirement for vacation time. The only required time off is New York's paid sick leave. So often people are confused thinking they have to offer. I recommend it again in a world where we can't necessarily pay as much as what other people are paying. Offering time off in variations, different types or different classifications, but not required.
My organization, they have half an hour paid, unpaid lunch, half an hour paid. The half an hour derived from 2 breaks put together. What is the logistics of legality of having them on an unpaid and then also a paid, and they leave the site for their unpaid time, but they're still.
So you should have it all, a policy written about leave, so or break periods is what I would call it. So I would have lunch break, you're given a 30-hour uninterrupted, or 30-minute uninterrupted, lunch period over this time frame. And you're expected to take it, you're expected to document it, and it will be unpaid. Second break, you have 2 paid breaks over the course of the day that add up to 30 minutes, or however you want to put it. You're expected to stay on site. That is not a requirement that you give them that leave, so you can say whatever you want to say, and if they don't follow it, then it's a performance issue. Just like if you're requiring them to punch in and out for lunch, if they're not hourly employees, and they're not doing that, like I said, I go back and add it for them, but that's a performance issue. They're not following your direction or your policy.
Could you explain a little around flex time? So when you have an employee and you're like, look, we don't have the overtime pay or whatever, how do you work flex time in? Is that also paid, or is that just time off, right? How do you work that?
So when you're saying flex time, you mean it's time that they can take off?
Yeah.
You can have any classification of time off that you want to. The only thing that I would call it whatever you call it, and I would be consistent with its application and let people know how much of that they have, and just make sure they're following whatever policy you set forth, because it's not legally mandated. You can manage it any way you want to. And you're also not required to give that, but I understand why you would have such a thing. Another type of flex time that people talk about is having flexible work arrangements, meaning you can work one day or another day or different hours.
Sometimes, but it's still paid,
Yes.
right?
Well,
That'll be considered-
again, because flex time is not a required category of work or leave, you don't have to pay anything. If it's a scheduled time, but you allow them to maneuver it,
Right.
and they're supposed to get paid for the hours they're working, then you would need to pay them.
You can't say to somebody, you've worked 48 hours, we're not paying you overtime for the 8 hours, you gotta put it somewhere else.
No.
You can't do.
I mean, you can
can't
have
do
a
that.
policy that says no one is to work more than 40 hours without approval. And that approval could mean anything you want it to mean. It could be a sheet of paper that has 5 signatures on it. But if they actually work it, you have to pay them.
And that's New.
And it's a
that's New
performance
York
issue, so
State.
if they work without approval, that's a performance issue, so it can be dealt with in that way.
Right, and you're clearly not allowed to say to them, because I've been asked, well, if I
Yes.
go overtime, why can't I just bank my time?
Overtime needs to be paid.
Hey, that's.
But if you have some other policy that you can be creative if you're trying to incentivize people with some other things, but overtime and hours worked, if anyone works and they're supposed to be paid a certain rate for those working times, then they need to be paid.
If somebody works 42 hours one week, right? You can't put them at 40 and say, just take 2
No.
hours off next week. That's completely
No.
not.
Yeah.
And a work week isn't necessarily Sunday to Saturday, it can be whatever your defined work week is, but if there's a 7-day period that's typically like your pay period, and you work more than 40 hours in that work week, and it can't fluctuate, it has to be the same work week, then yes, you can't tell people to bank hours in another
If
week.
you get paid bi-weekly, it does not matter, it's weekly. If
You
work
still,
overtime
yes,
that
it's
week-
still weekly if you get paid, and that causes a lot of trouble. There's a difference between 26 pay periods and 24 pay periods too. The 24 pay periods causes a lot of trouble when you have hourly employees who are eligible for overtime. Because you still have to somehow track those work weeks, those 7 days, and you do need to accurately pay them overtime for those weeks, even though you're only getting paid every 15 days. Yes?
And if an exempt person works a special event and they have gone over their normal hours in a week, they can have the flex time.
Well, if you have exempt employees, get the same pay no matter what they work, right? But if you want to be generous and say, if you work so many events or this event, you can have a couple hours off next week or whatever. But I would always recommend documenting these policies, and again, making sure that you apply them across the board. Don't pick and choose who you're allowing to do these things and not let it apply to the same classification of employee. You can diversify amongst different employees, so obviously your hourly paid people have certain rules you have to follow. Your salaried people have a little bit fewer rules to follow, but you can do different things for the two chunks, but you have to be careful with that.
Had sexual harassment training, meaning we have a board that's very hands-on in our communities, and a lot of times we're on site
Yeah.
with events and whatnot. They've been kind of haggling with the idea of whether they should be mandated.
If they're actively involved on a regular basis with your workplace or your employees, yes, I would include them in that training. Because ultimately, if they were interacting with employees or on site and they themselves were harassed, or they were themselves the harasser, it would fall within your policy either way. So it's highly recommended if they're heavily involved to do so. Just like the volunteers.
So I know there's a separation between contracted and then at some point they become employees, right? At what point do we make that decision?
This is another thing that's very difficult. Both federal law and state law, it's based on case law, and there's a number of factors you consider, but ultimately it falls down to control. And do you treat this person like you treat all of your other workers who are employees? So typically a contractor has their own specialty or their own business, and that's why you're hiring them to come in. They bring their own materials, they bring their own tools, they bring their own stuff, they direct their own project, you're not directing them. They don't get any pay from you, they don't get any benefits, they don't even get the holiday off that the rest of the office has off. So the more you don't treat them like your employees, the more they're more realistically an independent contractor. Typically, there's an agreement too that says you're an independent contractor. They should be coming with their own workers' comp. You should not be providing workers' comp for them. That's a big one, and I talked to someone here today about that, because that would be considered a factor of treating them like an employee. So it's really a balancing act, but treating them less like an employee and with more independence and less control from you.
With an understanding and contract in the beginning.
Yes,
That conversation
absolutely,
needs to
yes.
happen.
And if there is somewhere where they're becoming more like an employee, or you want to bring them on like an employee, you need to have that conversation, and you need to I would document that switch very, very well.
If you have an internship program, they're considered employees, and the state Bureau of funding says they only get paid for the hours that they work, do you still have to give them sick time?
Yes. Anyone who works and is an employee getting paid under your payroll has to, or at the very least earns 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So it doesn't have to be like, so if, let's say you give all of your employees, you say you qualify for 5 paid sick leaves based on the size of your organization, you can have a classification for interns. Interns will earn paid sick leave under New York state law, then they will earn it 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, which is what the law says. And they don't need to get it until they earn it. So you're not giving them a bucket of 5 days to take off, but they're eligible for the time off as they earn it.
Even if there's no stipend or there's no payment to the intern?
That's an interesting situation because most interns should be paid in New York State. There's a lot of difficulty. If they're more like a volunteer, or if they're getting college credit, there's all kinds of different
They're getting high school credit.
Or high school credit.
We're talking about high school students, high school credit, high school internship, 160 hours.
But they're getting paid.
Well, under state and federal law, if somebody's receiving their high school or college credit, that constitutes income.
So they're not getting other pay besides credit?
No, but this specific program, I don't know anybody in the
Yeah.
statewide, I'm on the statewide.
There could be some exceptions to that, let me look into that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah, but in general, anyone, whether it's an intern or anyone who's getting paid in getting other benefits of employment, and I don't mean benefits when I say that, they likely would fall under that, but again, there could be exceptions that I'm not necessarily aware of the internship program.
I want to thank everybody who presented today. I want to thank everybody at Ulster Savings that helped us in Ulster Insurance. And it's so important that you are all here today. We appreciate the support, and I hope that you all feel the support that we are giving as an organization back to the community. Please remember, if you have any questions, I know it's a lunch and learn and we have to get out and do 1,000 things. Any questions, please come back and let me know. Anybody who would like to have further conversation, please email me, we'll get that together. Please don't forget your swag bag and enjoy everything in it. And again, thank you and have a beautiful day, everyone.